What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Hope you're all doing well. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to click here on another video. I always appreciate it. And today we're going to be talking about the first true installment, but kind of not, and we'll get into that in just a little bit, but the first true installment into the new vision for James Gunn and Peter Safran and what the DCU on the big screen is going to be. And that film is called Superman. Written and directed by James Gunn, this film stars people like David Corenswet, Rachel Brosnahan, Nicholas Hoult, Eddie Gathegi, Isabella Merced, Nathan Fillion, and more. And before we get into the review, let's hear a word from today's sponsor. So you guys know that one of my favorite things to do in this world is go to the theater and watch some movies. But one of my favorite parts of that experience is going to the concession stand and getting a big old bucket of popcorn and putting that layer of salt and butter on top, shaking it up and chowing it down during the film. But there's nothing more disappointing than getting halfway through that bucket and realizing that those salt levels are not where you want them. And that's where the sponsor of today's video, Sprout, comes into play. It's the sprayable salt that's changing the game with 75% less sodium, but all of the flavor. Sprout is perfect for popcorn, wings, soft pretzels, and even when you're cooking dinner. Just spray and enjoy the taste without overdoing the salt. And the kind folks over at Sprout are offering my viewers 10% off of their purchase if you head on over to sprout.com and use promo code Perez at checkout. Again, head on over to sprout.com and use promo code PEREZ at checkout for 10% off of your order today. So what are you waiting for? Get your Sprout on. And a big thanks to those kind folks over at Sprout for sponsoring today's video. So let me start this off by ripping off the band-aid. I think like a lot of people, the way that the last continuity of DC films, the DCEU, the Snyderverse, whatever you want to call it, the way it all went down, the way it kind of just got pushed to the side, was unfortunate. I think it goes without saying. And I think when it comes down to the Henry Cavill of it all, I don't really like how he was handled. I wish they would have been able to find a way to push forward with that continuity despite any of the gripes that the audience had or any issues that certain films kind of posed. I wish they would have just kept pushing forward with that continuity, with that cast, because more than anything, as a lifelong fan of the DC comics, the same way I am with Marvel, I've just wanted to see a universe that's able to be fleshed out over movies and TV shows, whatever the case may be, the same way that comics or cartoons have been able to do that in the world of DC. It just unfortunately sucks that there's been maybe some Batman movies that have succeeded and a couple of one-off DC comics that have been able to have great movies here and there, but there are so many others that unfortunately have just been lost in the mix. And I think more than anything, there wasn't a vision at the top of the DCEU across the board, which ultimately led to where we are now. And listen, it goes without saying, Henry Cavill was a great Superman. He was great as Clark Kent. And so I'm just saying this off the top because I think there's going to be a lot of people who watch this video who, of course, are sad about what happened with Henry Cavill. And you're not alone. I'm with you. I think he was great in the character, great in the role. I was excited to see more with him, especially when he was teased at the end of Black Adam. But here we are now. And listen, ultimately, at the end of the day, as a fan of these characters and as a fan of this universe, I think it's more important that it's not just about the actor, but it's about pushing forward to see these stories brought to the big screen in a way that honors its legacy. And now, with people at the top who can have a vision to create a concise, story, I think that's ultimately what excites me the most. So here we are now with the first installment into this new DCU, even though there are still things from the previous DCEU that are still trickling in here, like Peacemaker and these other things that we know are still going to be playing a factor. I think Blue Beetle is also going to be a part of this current DCU, so it's a little bit messy still, and we'll figure out what works and what doesn't work and how they're going to include certain things. But without further ado, let's get into what this film is all about, and then we'll get into my thoughts on the film. This time around, it's not an origin story, and we find that Superman is already established in Metropolis and in the world in general. Clark Kent struggles with his Kryptonian identity while balancing his life as a reporter. He faces off against Lex Luthor and a pantheon of villains, including Ultraman, Engineer, and even a kaiju, while forming a team of metahumans and highlighting themes of truth, kindness, and hope. And I'm very happy to start this review off by saying that I loved this movie. I found this to be such a good time. And I think it's also something I'll say right off the top here, that if you were a fan of James Gunn, if you like what he's done in the world of comic book movies in general, with the 3 Guardians of the Galaxy films, as well as things like the Suicide Squad that he did, then I think you're going to have a lot of fun with this film. He brings that tone, he brings that vibe. While the film definitely has its own vibe and its own tone, I would just say if you've seen those films, you like his sense of humor, you like the way he approaches action, then I think you're going to enjoy a lot about this film. Now, one thing that surprised me going into it is that, like I already mentioned in that plot synopsis read, there isn't an origin story here. This isn't about you learning where Superman comes from 100% and seeing him, raised by mom, Pa Kent. None of that stuff is done here the same way it's been done in previous Superman movies. This is a film that jumps right into Superman already existing within this world. There are other heroes in this world. They already have established relationships. His relationship with Lois Lane is already established. So where there are things about this that are throwing you right into the world of Superman, which kind of reminded me in a lot of ways of what they did with the more modern Spider-Man films, with Spider-Man Homecoming, just throwing us in to this iteration of Spider-Man without us having to fully see the spider bite and Uncle Ben dying and all those different things. It just jumps right into it. And so similarly, this film jumps right into it and assumes that you already have that knowledge. Now, at the same time, I think it does kind of create, an open entry for people who are not super familiar with Superman. But if you're not familiar with Superman, I do think that this film kind of immediately assumes that you at least know some of the bare ideas of who he is, where he comes from, what his relationships are, that he works at the Daily Planet, all those different things. It kind of jumps straight into those things. But as a lifelong DC fan, as a lifelong Superman fan, I was excited to kind of just get into the mix of everything and just kind of see where this story would play off of. Now, if you've seen the trailers, you know that this film has a lot of characters. And I'll also go ahead and say this near to the top of this review that I do think my biggest gripe with the film is that it is a bit overstuffed. But a flip side of that criticism is that I think that James Gunn is a director who has shown us that he does a great job when it comes down to ensemble cast. Not only with Guardians of the Galaxy, but also with the Suicide Squad and some of the other films he's done. He's really good at balancing a lot of characters. And so while I do think that the film does at times feel overstuffed, I think for the most part, the heroes that are in this film, specifically the other characters kind of setting up the future of the Hall of Justice, perhaps, people like, Hawkgirl or, Mr. Terrific or Guy Gardner as Green Lantern, I think that they all have their moments in the film, with the standout of all of them being Mr. Terrific. I loved Mr. Terrific in this film, and I really enjoyed the performance from Eddie Gathegi. I thought he was great as this character, and we haven't really seen a lot of Mr. Terrific on the big screen. This is technically the first time he's on the big screen, but in terms of in live action, I think most people will think of the Arrowverse rendition, and as a fan of the version from the comics, I never really felt like that Arrowverse version was able to fully capture the character properly, and I think here they really lean into Mr. Terrific the way that I always envisioned him from the comics. I thought the performance was great, but all this to say, I think that our hero characters alongside Superman have time to shine, and when it comes down to the villains, I think that they all have their moments as well. But again, I would say at the same time, I do think a few less characters, even some of the side characters that are there just for a little bit, maybe characters that are part of the Daily Planet, that are name dropped so that you know who they are because you know they're a bigger part of storytelling within this world. I do think there's maybe too many characters in the mix, but that would honestly probably be my biggest gripe. And despite that, I think that James Gunn still handled the film really well in terms of balancing the time given to these characters and leaning into them in the moments that really helped service the story. Now, when it comes down to the title character, Superman, David Corenswet is great in this role. A lot of hate has been thrown his way, and there is a bit of a on-the-nose commentary on that in the film in terms of the people who have an opinion of him already before even seeing him or knowing who he is. But as an actor, David Corenswet is not somebody I'm super familiar with. I've seen him in a couple movies here and there, usually in supporting roles, and so to see him in this film take on this lead role as Superman, as Clark Kent, I really enjoyed him in the role. I thought that they did a great job of making him feel like the character from the comic books and the various iterations that we've had in the past. And this takes it back to basics. This is about hope. This is about a more bright, colorful Superman. This is about a Superman that, isn't afraid to be a little goofy or appear goofy. If you've seen all the marketing, he's got the trousers back, and that's something that it's always been a goofy element of Superman, but I think for the most part they capture it really well here, and I think that David Corenswet looks good in the role, and there are moments in here that really lean into that hope, that really lean into that brightness of the character, and in very endearing and charming ways also leans into some of that dad humor that Clark Kent is known for. And I think it really showcases the power of a well-written Superman in a Superman movie. I think when it comes down to what they've done with the character in more recent stories, they've made him a little bit of a darker character, or maybe not as goofy as he used to be in other iterations. And while this definitely leans into the goofy a little bit more, I think it never undercuts its themes or its messaging, which is ultimately hope, which is ultimately truth and kindness. And this is a self-exploration movie like many other Superman movies have been. And I think David Corenswet does a great job of leaning into that. He very much gave off that sense of hope. I really enjoyed him in the action, but I really enjoyed him in those endearing emotional moments as well. And there are moments in this film that I found myself kind of feeling that emotion rising up, where you just get these great shots of him, and you got, you know, that reprised John Williams score from the original films that's coming back in these really key moments that ultimately tugs on the heartstrings and makes you feel like, man, this is Superman. As one of my peers said as we were walking out of the theater, I felt like a kid again. That's what he said, and ultimately I have to agree. I walked out of this film feeling like a kid, and the pacing of the film is really solid as well. The movie flows. It's a little over 2 hours, about 2 hours and 10 minutes, and it never really felt like it dragged in any places. It wasn't boring, and I just felt like the character dynamics were really solid. I like that for a film that's jumping into it where these characters already have relationships, it did a good job of balancing out what they know about each other, what they don't know about each other, and allowing there to be just enough exposition for you to understand what this iteration of the world is without it feeling like it's spoon feeding you. And on the flip side, I really enjoyed the chemistry and the dynamic between Clark and Lois in this film as well. I thought that Rachel Brosnahan was great in the role as Lois. She very much felt like the character, that fierce character who's, you know, willing to be a reporter first sometimes than a partner. And I think that the way that they butt heads in the film very much feels like Clark and Lois. I really enjoyed that element of the film. I thought it was something that very much felt very true to the characters from the pages, but also from the various iterations we've seen in the past. And I would just say that across the board, I think that everybody really leans into their roles and very much feels like they're honoring the source material and honoring what's come before. Nicholas Hoult, as well as the character of Lex Luthor, he's a character that can oftentimes, you know, be a bit, you know, envious and childlike in the way he chooses to approach things, but he also has to come across very maniacal and very, you know, intelligent amidst all this. And I think he did a really great job of balancing those different things that Lex Luthor is known for. At times, you know, it does very much feel like he's not as threatening as he possibly could be, but I do think for the most part Nicholas Hoult leans into the role. You definitely can feel that tension between Superman and Lex Luthor that feels like the classic rivalry, and I'm honestly really excited to see what they do with these two actors as these characters moving forward. And if you've seen the marketing, you know that Krypto the Super Dog makes his first live action appearance in a big movie like this, and he was such a fun, charming, cute, and exciting part of this film. So much of the humor comes from him as well. Really enjoyed Krypto in here. I am curious to see how they handle Krypto moving forward in terms of some of the more comic book accurate elements of him. While we have seen the character on the big screen before in animation, where played by Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, it is nice to have a movie in live action where we get to see him alongside Superman for the very first time in a live action film. And in general, it was clear to me as a viewer and as a fan of the comics, as a fan of the video games and the cartoons that I've already mentioned, that James Gunn wanted to bring this back to basics. He wanted this to feel like a comic book movie. He wanted this to feel like the pages that you would read. He wanted it to feel bright, colorful, and hopeful. And that's something that is very much not necessarily exclusive to Superman, but Superman is part of what made that what it is in the world of comic books, you know? And so I like that we're brightening it up, that it was fun, that it was bright, that it was action-packed, that it was hopeful, that it was silly at times, but that it still had that drama. The film does a good job of also bringing things to a head by the time it comes to an end, but also sets up for more storytelling, as you would come to expect from any extended universe set of films. Ultimately, when it comes down to the cinematography, the look, the feel, the vibe of this film, the musical score, the performances, the costume design, the set design, and the locations used, I think this is a really good looking film, a really good sounding film. I got to see it in IMAX. It was was stunning to look at. There's some big fun spectacle, but there's also some moments I should also mention where some of the CGI is a little bit cartoony for sure in comparison to some of the really good practical effects that the cartoony CGI is within. But I do think there is some CGI that isn't as cartoony, and even the moments where the CGI is a little cartoony, I've always said this here on the channel that I am an advocate for CGI that may look a little cartoony as long as it fits the tone of the film. And even the cartoony CGI in this film ultimately for me still leaned into the overall tone of the film, so it didn't ever feel overly cartoony. But ultimately, when it comes down to a film about hope, about the kindness and Superman having to go through a self-discovery, I think that this film is exciting, predictable at times, but ultimately fun to watch. It was a really great time, and I'm really excited to see more David Corenswet as Superman. I think he was great in the role. There are moments and shots of him with that music playing that ultimately just had me sitting there thinking, this is Superman. So that's going to be my thoughts on Superman 2025. Definitely looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say. Are you planning on checking this film out? Are you still bummed about the Henry Cavill thing? Whatever the case may be, leave any and all comments down below, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.